He gets us. All right, everyone, welcome. You're on the Pill Pod, and it's 157. If you've listened to our last couple, you know that we are in the midst of the end of history, or at least there's some people that would like you to think so. So if this is the case, there are basically three responses or three families of theses that we can, use to situate ourselves in terms of our reaction to this event. The first is our favorite, of course, conservatism. And if you take the term literally, the meaning is to conserve something of the past and to protect it from ending. The second is progressivism, which, again, in its literal meaning, means there's some progress to be made. Sometimes that's big revolutionary steps, sometimes just a few tweaks here and there. And then somewhere between those two is just whatever we got, it's working fine enough. Let's keep going with it because it ain't so bad. So we spent a little bit of time exploring some of the loudest of the conservative brand of this, and they tend to be weird Catholic Christofascists, the right wing of the flock that loves Jesus. And some of you, our flock, our patrons, shouts out to Ben and Secret Asian Dan. They said that we should talk to a specific member of the progressive side of the Christian flock who also has a flair for history. So today we're welcoming John Hamer here. Hopefully he can help us figure out what he thinks history is still for. You can find him on YouTube. That's where I assume our people found him. Center Place, which I'm not sure, John. Is this a church? Is this a place that we could actually just hop on the subway and get to on Sunday morning if we're converted by the end of this conversation?
Yeah, well, you do have a physical location. I'm in it right here in Toronto Center Place, as we call it. And this is our church building that's in Old Town. So the congregation was first organized here back in 1836. And so this is the oldest part of the city. And yeah, we if you wanted to come here on Sunday, we will be here, church service at noon.
John, I was looking to see if you had done any podcasts so I could prep on this. And there is a John Hamer I found, although he's a conspiracy theorist who's particularly concerned with the sinking of the Titanic. So is that you?
No.
Okay.
That is another John Hamer is a surprisingly common name. Because when I was a kid, I didn't think Hamer was very, normally people assume Hammer, right? And then in fact, it would be the most common name. But yeah, there are a couple. So there's a journalist in Washington State, there's an athlete, and then there's also a conspiracy, kind of a Titanic conspiracy theorist kind of guy. So
well, he goes on these podcasts with names like the THC Hour. So if a pastor was going on the THC Hour, cool. It's just not the first thing I'd think of.
Yeah, it's a different one.
Though you do have a pretty mixed bio, cool bio, pastor,
yeah,
map maker, which is pretty dope,
yep,
and a lecture history of Christianity / Christianity YouTube channel. And
yes,
I didn't watch any full videos because they're extensive, but let's say
they're long.
Let's say it's a little bit different from the Christian intellectuals we've been covering the last few weeks. So,
yes,
as you know, we covered some of your conservative counterparts, but as non-sacramental individuals ourselves, we couldn't, or we could figure out what they think history is for in the Christian religion, but we didn't want to take this one position as the only position. So that would be like, let's take over all of the world's political systems, which makes sense to me as a goal. But browsing your content makes me think that you might have a different idea of Christianity.
Yes, absolutely. We have a very, very different idea. So it's a broad movement that has, if anything, since the Enlightenment, fractured into some pretty diverse paths. And so the conservative branches of Christianity, which by far and away are the loudest and best known branches, I think, to most people, have been a reaction against, let's say, academic findings, against science. Often they have tripled down on trying to read biblical texts literalistically. And it's not a way that the texts were actually ever understood historically, because, as you are aware, when you're living in modern times, you are not living as a medieval person. You aren't existing within the medieval worldview anymore. You're existing in the modern worldview with all of the new data. And now, in order to maintain that position, you're reacting against it and creating something new. And so, whereas they call it conservatism or preservation, in fact, it's a reactionary movement. And fundamentalism in general, in all religions, is a modern movement, not a medieval or an ancient movement. And so progressive Christianity, as you were kind of defining where we are in history, whether we want to conserve or maybe regress, go back, progressives, I guess, are hoping for improvement. So, and that's certainly the aim of my denomination and what I'm involved in here.
So to ask, I guess this might be simplistic, but just so we can get it out of the way, did history end in 30 AD? And if not, then like, what's the purpose of this lull between Christ dying and coming back? What are you guys trying to get done in the meantime?
So yes, a lot of Christianity, and certainly as Christianity developed, it was developed before modern academic disciplines like history. So there was an ancient understanding of history, the ancient Hellenistic historians, Thucydides, and so on, but their tools that they had lacked capacity to really make very sophisticated judgments about history. And so largely people read texts and understood them, and they presumed that sort of thing happened. They didn't have a great way to do what we do now with history, where we are able to say, what is the likelihood of this scenario? History lets us read the different sources that we have, and we read them against the rest of the archaeological record and so on, in order to tease out what the most likely scenario is. And so now we have all kinds of tools. The academic discipline of literary criticism was largely developed in order to study the Bible, and so we have centuries now of tools that allow us to understand those things. And so, in terms of your like the lull between 30 and a literalistic second coming, that is almost for I would say within my tradition is an irrelevant question. So because we are not we're not imagining a literal second coming of Jesus where history will end and the whole world will be destroyed or anything like that. Rather, we understand the alternate, more spiritual understanding that also dates back to the first century, which is that the kingdom that Jesus is talking about, that overturns empire, that overturns unjust systems in the world, that society is already here among us, or that new spiritual age of Christ having returned is here among us, but we have to build towards it. And we do that by challenging unjust systems, by making the world more equitable, and so on. So
that sounds great to me.
Yeah, I'm curious, how would you situate your like that kind of account, and as someone who doesn't know that much about like theology, but like in comparison to what some of the conservative Christian views, like I don't know, and maybe it's okay if I don't know how much time you spend kind of surveying like what these rival are like more conservative Christians. So you mentioned literalist interpretations, I suppose. So like, would you say like that's one of the major differences between a more conservative oriented, or are there other major disagreements?
There are lots of other major disagreements.
I bet.
And before you answer that, because we all of us did read for today one of my new favorite guys.
Yeah,
a fucking
ironically favorite,
a psychopath, Cornelius Adrian Comstock Vermeulen, who wants
why do they all have these names, eh?
Yeah, very like nobility.
He wants the Catholic Church to take over again. Like, and he's a Harvard law professor, so
yeah, they're roughly in the Catholic integralist or maybe post-liberal tradition. If you're talking about their sort of more political goals, you talk about them as like post-liberal. Adrian Vermeulen's he's a legal scholar, a constitutional scholar at Harvard. So, I mean, pretty big name university there. and they're
Yeah.
having quite the influence on politics and the court system. Well, yeah, these people have a certain, I shouldn't say, like people like Vermeulen and Deneen, who we've been reading lately, have a certain perspective on American politics grounded in Catholicism and in a kind of conservative right-wing interpretation of Catholicism. That's what I mean. That just to remind our audience and everyone what we've been sort of thinking about in the past couple episodes.
But is he a literalist in terms of interpretation? John, you're probably the best to answer that. I don't know that he cares that much about the Bible so much as the. And by the way, this guy's not even born Catholic. That's the terrifying part. He's like, we need to return to the traditions that we are born into, and he just crossed over from some other
The movement appealed to him.
It's such a strange perspective all around because the United States has never been majority Catholic, and indeed when we're talking about like a time period that was less pluralistic, when there was more of a hand in hand with churches, maybe even than the present in U.S. politics, it was definitely pro-Protestant, and there was a lot of persecution, against Catholic institutions. Where here in Canada we have, because of the large French Catholic population, there was always a little bit more connection between the government and having the Catholic Church. It was never that way in the United States. From my religion's perspective on what the freedom of religion is, for example, as defined in the U.S. Constitution, it is in fact the separation of church and state. Because if you had a state religion in the South in the U.S., which is, I guess, the place where they want it the most, that's going to be the Southern Baptist Convention. And so every one of the little churches, or certainly then Jews and Muslims and everybody else, that is not going to be, you are going to be persecuted. And that would have always been true in the past anyway for Catholics. And so the idea that you could have any kind of a Catholic fascist government in the United States it seems so crazy to me. So, I mean, I see where that movement has come out of places like, like Brazil or Spain, someplace where out of Franco's Spain, they think maybe they could bring, this from a personal dictatorship to instead maybe being a religious dictatorship, or something like that. But obviously Spain went a different way after Franco's fall.
Yeah, for sure. Pills, I remember on the episode that we did on the kind of, what was it called? Imaginative Christians, that website that we were looking at. And I don't know if John ended up looking at them or is familiar with them, but I remember like we ended up getting a bunch of angry, comments and that they were like, oh, these guys aren't even they should actually talk to a Christian, they should actually, and I forget, what were some of the things that they were complaining about? Cause like, I don't know. I mean, maybe before we get into the article, I just kind of thought of this now. I should have maybe gone and looked at some of the comments, but I wonder if there's some things that they said in the comment that now we could run by John and just be like, here's an actual Christian, who's a thoughtful, intellectual, dare I say. I don't know if you self-identify as an intellectual, but
sure.
I think they just said you guys need to read the Bible, because then we'd know,
Yeah.
With all your YouTube lectures, John, do you ever pay attention to the comments?
Yeah.
Because I was thinking that if we got the sort of backlash that we did for just barely even dipping our toes in the water, what is the worst comment you have ever got from a fundamentalist Christian?
Oh, well, okay. I don't pay a lot of attention to those comments. I get so many positive comments, but yeah, I mean, they're you're the Antichrist, you're going to burn in hell. I mean, there's fundamentalists are, they're all over the place with that kind of, they're ready to go.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what the comment section of this conversation is going to be. I don't know if we'll have some of the same ones, because I know some of the ones who left comments in our first episode were definitely of that weird right-wing variety.
No, I mean, I would love to be the Antichrist. That's like a big deal, right?
Oh yeah, they don't mean I'm the Antichrist. You are Antichrist. So it's just as an act,
or a soldier of the Antichrist.
Anathema. Well, one of the through lines I've noticed when we read the Imaginative Conservative, when we looked at Deneen, and when we looked at Vermeulen, one of the big through lines I've noticed is that, well, they are self-identified conservatives. They have their political perspective. They want to be on the Republican side, but they also think that the Republican Party has kind of fallen prey to liberalism, a generally liberal outlook. So, I mean, what John was saying earlier about them being not conservative in the sense of keeping a tradition alive, but more so reactionary. They're reacting against something. I mean, they're reacting against Enlightenment liberalism, so they are kind of conserving that tradition of being on the far right side of Parliament in their political outlook, saying, liberalism is corrupting not just the left, but the right, the side of the aisle we want to be on. And we need to somehow get back to a more conservatism. And this, our sort of post-liberalism, that's why it's called post-liberal, because they want to get away from liberal principles altogether. So again, what John was saying about, say, pluralism, they kind of don't want that sort of thing. Pluralism is maybe too liberal, or maybe they want a certain kind of pluralism that fits more with their perspective. I'm not sure how they would frame that, but yeah, that seems to be a through line, is being opposed to liberalism, whether it's on the right or the left, and rebuilding civilization because it's been so corrupted by these Enlightenment and French Revolution principles.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a good point in that they appear to be looking backwards, but the nostalgia is very selective, such that it's actually productive in the sense that they want to move forward with this piecemealed, artificial portrait of history. Like Vermeule says that liberalism is fine with a tame version of Christianity or Catholicism, but not with this militant state seizure version of Catholicism that he's hoping for, which I think is, it's true. But John, I'm wondering, I know there are as many views on this as there are denominations, at least. But what place does power or worldly power, political power, have within Christianity? Because what I know about what Jesus said, it seems to be pretty often, you let them do their thing, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, but we're not about the way the world's doing stuff. We're about this other alternative future. So how do you reconcile that tension?
Yeah. Well, I think that perhaps anyway, the reason why, like you say, some of these people in this kind of right-wing intellectual movement actually convert to Catholicism is not because of a sense of trying to get back to the original teachings of Christ, but maybe because of the thinking about a time period when we used to call the West Christendom. So thinking back to the Middle Ages, when out of the Gregorian Reform movement of the papacy, when the recovery of Roman law in the West, and the creation of things like the law school of the First University of Bologna, so that there was suddenly like a system that theorized like a right reign on earth, where the Pope is the vicar of God on earth. And so it's like almost even in the Middle Ages, though, a totally theoretical thing. It's if you go to the actual history, popes never got a hold of that kind of power, no matter how much they might have wanted it. Even the most the closest guy who got there, Innocent III, really it more or less unraveled in front of him. And so it was never, it's always kind of even a theoretical a thing to imagine, but in the modern times, I mean, that it's so contrary to the entire trend of history and everywhere we are, that nothing's going back in that direction. I mean, I was thinking about it in the Canadian experience. I'm able to serve as one of the two observer members on the Canadian Council of Churches for my denomination. And I was in Quebec City for the semi-annual meeting. And they're dealing with the secularism law, and how the church there, which as recently as a half century ago, as of the 1950s and early 60s, the church had been almost like the state. But the trend, even here in North America, in the most state-like part of church-state relations, Quebec, that evaporated and is gone. And so now the church is struggling to even think, well, now that we are a much reduced church, the Catholic Church in Quebec, how are we being a church? What is our identity, given the huge trend of secularization in even Quebec society? So much less the United States is going to be. I mean, all of these, right-wing religious, even evangelical conservatives who are not Catholics, they're evangelicals. Even them, the church attendance has actually collapsed. They're identity voters. They call themselves Christian nationalists or whatever, but it isn't necessarily have anything to do with church or Christianity or church control over anything. It's a identity movement.
That's an interesting way of putting it. And by the way, for listeners who might not be aware, who are non-Canadian, but in Quebec they passed this Bill 21, very controversial. People argue that it's targeted towards Muslims because the whole idea is like, if you're a public servant, if you work in any public institution, I think that includes government departments or like teachers, because those are, I think, public employees, right? They wouldn't be allowed to wear any overt religious symbols. So that would include, a kippah if you're Jewish, and obviously like a hijab or a burqa, right? So that wouldn't be allowed. And obviously the reason I think it may have emerged in a time when Quebec society was sort of reacting, or this particular brand of Quebec conservatives were, had fears about Islamic fundamentalism. I think that might have been like the starting point, right? And then it's like, well, let's pass these laws. And, to be honest, they're pretty popular as far as I know among Quebec voters. I think it's probably over 60% support it. But so I actually spent quite a lot of time talking about this with some of my students, because last semester I was teaching a law, justice, and rights class, and we had to teach them about how in Canada, well, they're like, doesn't that violate the charter? I'm like, yeah, but they can do it anyway because we have the notwithstanding clause. But that's a whole other conversation about like Canadian jurisprudence. But yeah, just the point is it's a law, and I guess it does raise questions just about like what role. So I'm curious actually of that conversation that you had there, John, with people in Quebec, and the churches in Quebec, because I don't know, did you feel like most of them were supportive of this law, or most of them were worried about it because it's just further marginalizing the role of church, right, in society?
No, they were not supportive of it, but not because they were worried it was marginalizing, I think, the role of church. There was the concern, I think. I don't always agree, with bishops in the Catholic Church on a lot of things. Where I represent a further, left tradition, I think, than a lot of times. Although I'm really impressed with Catholic leaders in Canada often. So, but the Archbishop there said they wanted to carve out an exception because the Quebec legislature has always had a big cross, like on the back of the, in the back of the chamber, and they're like, oh yeah, but we're gonna make it so you can't have any religious symbols, but we're gonna keep our big cross.
Yeah,
and
that was hilarious.
It's like such a crazy symbol of oh yeah, we're not only this is a general thing, we're doing it for against for secularism and religious freedom for everybody, but actually we're really only doing this against Muslims. Is almost what that's saying.
The Quebec flag.
The church said no, and because they're saying, oh, this is the flag too, and so this is they're saying, well, no, this is just part of our heritage. It's not part of our religion. And so the church was really spoke up and said, well, we want you to take it down, because if it's just a heritage thing and part of your nationalism or whatever, and it has nothing to do with religion, then we actually don't want you using it. And so no, I think that they were very opposed to anyway some of what's happening because of concern that it's discrimination against Muslims and other religious minorities. So.
I like the way that you described too the fact that some, a lot of these voters who are on the right who identify as conservatives, they're really identity voters. Like, I think that's kind of an interesting way of putting it, that like most of them maybe aren't even really thinking about like gospel or like the actual concrete practice of religion, and more just thinking about like, well, I don't want that, so I'm going to identify as this thing. But yeah, I think the Quebec law was interesting because there seemed to be maybe a bit of an alliance of, I guess, I don't know what you'd call them, but like secular atheists who are like, and just kind of, I don't know, I feel like there's a bit of like this French cultural thing, because in France they did something similar. There's just this sort of French ideal of, I think they call it laïcité or something, or laïcité. Yeah. So there's that, and like that is actually in some ways like in a long tradition of just being like against church power, right? Or like against anything. But then obviously there's maybe the right wing kind of like Islamophobic identity voters. So yeah, it's interesting.
In the public sphere, because they've been a deeply Catholic country as well, but they have a certain interpretation of the public sphere and what is kosher there and what isn't.
So I got a question. I don't want to call it a hard ball, but it's not exactly a softball. It's a mid ball. John, if you're looking at these guys, especially the American Catholics, which is, I think, funnier than they realize. If you're saying that this institution of the church as the state on earth is a pipe dream.
Yes.
But then for us non-sacramental individuals, I won't even say non-religious, but non-sacramental individuals,
Yeah.
we're staunchly realistic. And we know that the collapse of communism is imminent and the Marxist revolution is right around the corner. We look at Christians saying we're going to build the kingdom of God on earth, and we think that's a pipe dream. So I wanted to know politely how you'd respond to that kind of thing when we're looking at secularism, church attendance decline, people picking up, supermarket religion and buying magic rocks and believing in all this weird stuff.
New Age.
How is the
Yeah.
kingdom of God supposed to survive in a climate like that?
Yeah. Well, so we're a very tiny denomination, right? So there's 53 congregations here in Canada. We are in 60 different countries, but the whole total membership of my church is 250,000. So, we have one of the ways that we maybe look at this is the this parable of the hummingbird, and there's a forest fire and all of the animals are panicking and running around and things like that, and they notice that the hummingbird is going to the river and bringing back a little hummingbird's worth of water to kind of put out the fire, and the elephants or whatever asking, what in the name of all that is holy are you doing? And the hummingbird says, I'm doing my part. And so even though my congregation is very tiny and much dwindled from where we would have been even in the 1950s in terms of members. One of our major focuses that we've had here in Toronto for building up the kingdom of God on earth is that, I'm right here downtown. There is a major social justice issue in terms of housing justice and being underhoused. And so compared to the little tiny postage stamp of real estate that is the church, we also own 3 social housing projects, a tower and 2 other apartment buildings, and we're breaking ground on a 4th one, where we are working to do our part to take people who would otherwise be in danger of homelessness and allow them to be able to have that dignity of being housed, and that's just one of the ways that we are trying to bring that about. Another program that my little church did is we saw, well, this is a really diverse city. It's, this is about in the 90s, and it was becoming so pluralistic and religiously diverse, and we were seeing, well, there's so much bigotry that is coming from ignorance. Like in 9/11, because of the immediate backlash, apparently there were these Americans who attacked Sikh Americans, in Arizona because they
Yes.
were wearing turbans. Obviously,
If there's anything more offensive than racism, it's ignorant racism.
and so obviously we don't want to educate people to don't attack them, attack somebody else. I mean, that's not the point of the education, but the point of it is how little education that they have, that they actually, in their fury of anti-Islamophobia, that they attack Sikhs. This is not anyway. So there is peace that could be made through education. So we created what we call the Encounter World Religion Center. We hired a religious studies professor. We teach courses where you go and you learn all the academic studies about all these faiths. Then you go meet them in their own place of worship. So you go to the Sikh Gurdwara, you go to the mosque, and we also have programs where you take kids from the Islamic schools and we take them to the synagogue and vice versa, so that we can do our little part for peace. And so that's how we're busily laying out the kingdom of God here on earth, without you guys even noticing, because we're too tiny to pay attention to. But that's we're working at it.
Pretty good answer.
Yeah, that's amazing.
That's too good of an answer. It's like teacher's pet putting everyone else to shame.
Yeah.
Well,
We just housed thousands of people in downtown Toronto. No biggie. There's some praxis.
Yeah.
But my follow-up, back to a previous conversation we had, we got stuck on this issue of, like, why do Christians do anything? And I think Eric's answer was something like, oh, it's got to be a pathology. because they have to like work out their salvation on earth. And I'm wondering, because we've read, probably all of us have read like Luther and the sola fide, just the faith thing. So
Yeah.
you don't have to do the good material, good works that you're doing, or
Right.
do you? I'm not sure.
In Lutheranism. So
Yeah, in Lutheranism, good people will do good works. You don't
That's
need
right.
to do good works to be a good person. It's the
Yeah,
other, kind of the other way around.
and it's even more in Calvinism, right?
What is Calvinism? You just do it anyway and hope that you like sneak in at the end.
Predestination, baby.
Yeah.
You hope you sneak in.
You go where you go.
You go where you go, or you're already there in eternity. So I guess, John, the soteriological question, the salvific question, why do you do the stuff that you do, and
So
what's the point?
Yeah, but so it depends on the Christian type, right? So like you've mentioned out some of the focuses there, in all the different traditions. So like in Catholicism, there is an emphasis on works, right? But in all of these cases, you're not punished for doing terrible things or rewarded. You don't get to go to heaven because of good works. You do because the theological understanding is that heaven is so amazing that no one is worthy of it, and so it is by grace that you're given salvation in that way. It's a gift, and so it isn't really shouldn't be the focus, I guess, no matter who's talking about it. My tradition in particular, we really we don't emphasize afterlife. We're not focused on afterlife. We're focused on this life, and we're trying to bring about the city of God here on earth, and make heaven on earth, as opposed to that. So from my perspective, to whatever afterlife would be like, it would be such a different experience or non-experience from temporal existence on earth that it's not something that we would be able to grasp and have to worry about. So
I'm curious, John, did you like, I don't know if you don't have to answer personal questions if you don't want to, but I'd be
No, it's
curious,
fine.
like,
No,
what your background is and how you came to the church, and did you grow up in a religious family, or was your family already like a member of this denomination, or was this something you came into on your own?
So my little denomination here is called Community of Christ. And so Community of Christ is a branch of the Restoration movement, and then from the Restoration movement, the Latter-day Saint movement. And so in the Second Great Awakening in North America in the early 19th century, several churches like the Disciples of Christ, and the Adventists, and then especially most famously from us anyway, the Mormons, grew out of that. And so in the original, my church is one of the two original Mormon churches. We don't use the word Mormon to describe ourselves, but anyway, it is one of them. And so when the founding prophet was killed, the church split apart. So in the same way that Islam split apart after the death of Muhammad, so some people followed the companions of Muhammad, some people followed the family. So the people following the companions of the prophet moved to Utah, where they changed a lot of, not changed, but they followed the later doctrines and were specifically focused on polygamy. We were the group that opposed polygamy. And so we stayed in the Midwest, we stayed here in Canada. And while the Utah LDS Church, they gave up polygamy, but they're a fairly, I would call them a fundamentalist church in terms of being literalists. They have a kind of an interesting non-Trinitarian theology that they have. So they've rejected traditional monotheism, was what I would say. Our church is hewn more towards a very progressive Christianity that makes us more theologically, we're not that far away, or at least socially, we're not that far away from a church like the United Church in Canada, or one of the other progressive churches.
Yeah, I don't blame you for moving away from the Mormon, just because of some of the associations with that term, with the polygamy. Yeah, and I'm not sure if the Book of Mormon is a very good PR for it either. That they're back in town, they're doing.
The show. The show.
It is
in town right now.
The show, and I didn't know you. I didn't know that there were Mormons like you. I gotta say, you're doing some. great PR here because everything I know about Mormonism comes from South Park.
Well, I mean, there's something to the one South Park show where there's talking about Joseph Smith and Martin Harris and Lucy Harris and so forth on the translation. That story isn't that, like at the end of the story where the Kyle or whatever says, wait a second, you believe this? You tell this story and you believe this? And he says, yeah, the story proves it. He's like, no, don't you understand? The story says the opposite.
Dum 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 dum.
So
that's the refrain.
That actually makes a pretty good point. Anyway, but yeah, no, what I'll say, so you're asking about me personally. So yes, my ancestors joined 7 generations ago in 1832.
Oh, wow.
And indeed, at the end in Nauvoo, when Joseph Smith did start to abuse his authority by marrying other men's wives, by marrying girls, having a secret polygamy thing that he's doing. He asked my great grandparents if they wouldn't give their 15-year-old daughter to him to be a wife, and they said yes. So bad grandparents. But anyway, so it is a horrible abuse of the founder's authority, where he's, this is the kind of thing that happens a lot in these personality, little tiny personality religions. And so there's a lot of errors and bad things that are back in our beginning that we've worked through and processed as a people subsequently.
So it sounds like, just to clarify too, it sounds like, I guess you were saying that your family was like in Utah, I guess, like, and then you just kind of found, oh no,
we grew up in that church. The church is all over
the
world. There are Utah Mormons here in Canada, of course.
Oh, got it.
Like the LDS is the big one, right?
There are millions of members, the LDS church.
And then there's another, what's the super fucked up one? The fundamental FLDS?
The FLDS church is one of the most famous because of their prophet that is in jail right now for committing some horrible atrocities of his own. I've been to their headquarters in southern Utah. Part of the work that I do in my ministry as a Christian and a Latter-day Saint pastor is go to Utah to help people who are processing all of this. And so, for example, even the main LDS church has been very, very anti-gay, anti-LGBTQ, and so that causes Utah to have the highest gay teen suicide rate in the whole United States. And so I usually go there maybe 1 or 2 times a year, as just to try to one of the things that helps prevent suicide is to simply say, hey, there's an alternative. If there's anybody, if anybody thinks that they're at the end and there's no possible alternative, hey, you don't have to have given up every single thing, your worldview, your faith, and all of these things just because your church is telling you your personhood doesn't exist. And so I definitely have gone both to Utah generally, to Salt Lake and Provo to visit ex-Mormons or struggling Mormons, but also to the ex-FLDS headquarters there in Colorado City, where when their prophet was arrested, and the trust got put into the control of the state because of various reasons, and so I was helping some of the new ex-FLDS leaders, to kind of put their community back together. I mean, and I didn't do very much, but I did what I could.
So this is the FLDS. These are they pop off on like reality TV when they have like the 20 kids shows. Is that the FLDS?
That's usually the AUB.
Oh, okay.
So the biggest polygamous church now is the Apostolic United Brethren, and they are less fringy than the FLDS. So the FLDS, if you see them wearing pioneer clothes,
yeah. These people are popping off on TikTok too, because it's part of the whole return to tradition, and there's like some mainstream buy-in to at least the fashion aspect.
Yeah,
of it.
Love it.
They go hard too. They're like in the pioneer clothes, like churning butter and kneading dough. A lot of people like this.
So like the one that is like the My Five Wives or whatever, like that's a reality show. That's the AUB. If they're wearing pioneer clothes, that's FLDS. So
okay, wow, yeah, I was actually in Arizona not that long ago, and I remember there's a big LDS presence there, and I remember my buddy drove me by this like enormous church. Like, I guess I don't know if they call it a cathedral, whatever the parlance is, but yeah, it's Temple. Got it. Yeah. It was quite an impressive building, I will say.
Yeah.
But
wow.
John, next question. We we very much, I think, probably vibe with what you're saying in terms of, let's do counseling, let's bring this like very corporeal,
Working on real issues, you could say. Yeah.
very corporeal aspect to like housing and teen suicide and
love
stuff
it.
like this. So, I mean, it sounds like what I know of the United Church of Canada, especially, is like, come here. We don't care about your identity. You don't have to sign stuff. You don't have to like prick your finger with blood or whatever else it is. So I want to ask on behalf of myself, but on the behalf of a generally leftist audience, all this material stuff, great. Then how is it that all the religious woo-woo stuff fits into it? Because it might be a false dichotomy, religious life versus the rest of life. But to me, when I hear, like you just said, like a religious person saying, we don't really care about the afterlife, that's not our concern, then I go, well, what's the religion bit then? That's what I thought it was.
Non-corporeal.
Well, I mean, the question, even what is religion, is not easily a definable thing. We have since the Enlightenment, we have in the West drawn a little cordoned off box around what we call religion, and then everything that's not religion. In that it is actually not particularly relevant outside of our modern Western context. If you go to other societies, as European imperials and colonists went around and they looked at what was going on in India, it was very hard, for example, to draw the same box around it and say, well, here, when you have a holy text, that means that's a religion. When you have a shrine or something, that's a religion. But so many other things that people were doing in just their daily lives, that's not religion, because that's what in our place, we consider that secular, sports or watching TV or something. All those things all came out of religion, but we drew like a boundary lines around it. And that would include then doing social housing or doing education. I mean, those had been part of, religion. And I certainly think that that's a core focus of our religion. When I'm doing those things, I'm not separating our history lecture or even reading history books and things like that from, or doing the various charity work from any other component of the religion. That's religion too. So for us, it is not simply something that would be like rituals or like I don't know what you're thinking religion is. So anyway, or just you're praying all time or something like that. But there are components to what spiritual practices are for too, and those would be the components, that part of it. I think maybe you're asking about. So like a component would be, so what's the purpose of prayer? Might be a question. so there's a couple different ways you can look at that. So for some people, prayer is a daily spiritual practice where they wake up and it's almost like having a morning meditation, where you ground yourself, you take a little bit of stepping back from the rest of what's going on in the day. You are doing some self-discernment, some contemplation, and you aren't just immediately getting on the internet and getting to whatever has been thrown up on your social media or YouTube video that is feeding you. And instead you are thinking, what am I intending to accomplish this day? What are my hopes for this day? How is that fitting into a longer term perspective? So when we are stepping back and thinking with a bigger perspective, the eternal, that's the biggest perspective, then that is a utilitarian argument for a spiritual practice like that. And that would be a personal practice of it. And then there would also be a community practice where one of the time when you are getting together for some occasion, let's say it's we do these a lot still, even if you become secular, you often do them as a religious like ceremony, like a marriage or something. Part of having a shared community prayer is trying to bring everybody together and speak for the community what our hopes for this occasion and maybe our broader hopes are, and maybe an acknowledgement of our struggles and suffering. And so those would be examples of what that spiritual practice could be for.
That's really refreshing to hear. I feel like we spend too much time reading the conservative religions, and we maybe we do the Nietzsche thing and we start to become the monster a little bit ourselves, and we forget that religion is a concept that's very difficult to define. And yeah, the West has a certain idea of religion and spirituality, and what's the difference between, the material world and the spirit, mind, and body. We tend to maybe draw those distinctions a little too clumsily and simplistically, and it's not really that. One of the things I teach that always kind of inspires me is teaching Loyola's spiritual exercises,
Mhm.
where he's just talking about, it's almost, you can almost perform it as like a retreat, or you can just do it as almost like a quick meditation you don't have to do it as a full retreat, but you just kind of, it's about getting back to basics, just getting in touch with yourself and your and it does have a lot of overt, religiously themed Catholic themed things about God, but it's really almost like a self-help meditation, quiet, getting in touch with yourself and inner peace, and yeah, it really appeals to me, even though I'm not I consider myself atheistic or not religious, but I
Sure.
mean, I enjoy that sort of thing.
Not to horseshoe theory, but I'm gonna horseshoe theory because a lot of what John just described, and kind of Eric, even what you just described, these are the complaints that the militant Christofascist Catholics have also with what is missing in liberal society. It's the family connections, the gathering, the rights, the speaking on behalf of the community, maybe even some internal reflection thrown in there, maybe a couple of creeds at the center of the community that we can create values and organize
We're
around.
we're non-creedal, but yeah, we do not have a creed, but we definitely, well, so we do have, though, like a shared principles that are social justice oriented. So yeah.
But it sounds like you are also solving the problem that they are pointing out with liberalism, which is all we have today is markets, values are wishy-washy, there's attention markets, there's buying and selling, and everyone's so caught up in this that they're not paying attention to the family, the community, the close stuff. So even though your outcomes are completely different, theirs is like, let's take over the state so that we can implement the church as the state, like Catholic Iran, maybe. But it sounds like the solution of religion is the same on both sides. Is that fair to say, or am I off there?
Well, we're definitely not trying to take over the state. so,
Thank God.
That's a big
Darn.
that's a big difference. So I'll just hold that one aside. But I do think that there is I do think that there's something to a deconstruction that we've had in my lifetime, last half century, of local institutions, where we have taken ourselves down to being an individual or a very nuclear unit, just you and your couple and maybe a couple nuclear family, whatever, and you have your workplace association, and you have that, and then one of the reasons why I think that there is a disenfranchisement from the rest is that you are dealing with corporately, you're dealing with Amazon or something like that, or and then politically you're just thinking on the national level, and all you're not thinking anymore about your school district or your ward, your precinct. You're instead thinking only in terms of who's prime minister, who's the president of the United States, and everything becomes down to your tribe and the president of the United States, as opposed to I think it's still a liberal value to have local control, you know what I mean, or to have local institutions. And so I think that there had been all kinds of these. They could have been secular institutions that, I'm not saying that, I don't want to go back to times, because I know that these were institutions that discriminated, right? So, but we could still have an institution that doesn't discriminate. So like things like, though, different confraternities, the men's clubs. No, there's no such thing as Masons anymore, hardly, and all those kind of things where you could get together and have sort of a local place where you could share ideas and maybe all get together, and like the Shriners, and do something good for your community. Now those are all largely dismantled. All entertainment is happening for you at at the super cultural level, so that it's just something that you're being fed. And so I do think that there's something to, I'm not trying to go say, oh, let's go be Luddites and go live in some previous time where we didn't have all these screens, but rather, is there a possibility where a small group of people can get together with some, like you say, some shared values without a authoritarian creed that you're forced into, that maybe together you can accomplish something more than you could individually. And so, I mean, I just go back to the what we're doing. I'm very concerned about the social housing issue as a immigrant to Canada, as somebody who, I mean, we just moved in. I could not be the president of a social housing charity where we're laying the ground for a $60 million social housing project, that's also going to be all green, and all the other kinds of good things. I mean, I could contribute towards it in my little way, but I'm actually able to help in a very significant way, way past my personal impact, what that would be. So
Yeah, no, that's a good answer. I mean, I think, to kind of piggyback onto what Pills was saying, and I think it's maybe what he meant. Like, well, it sounds like from what you're saying that in a way you would agree with maybe like the societal diagnosis of some of these, more conservative. And in fact, one of the things we talked about on when we covered Patrick Deneen was that like some of the things that he says is like similar to what some like left-wing theorists say about like capitalism's effect on social ties and all these things. So maybe there's an agreement on the symptoms, but not the solution, right? And,
well, and I would say the systems, but I would say the symptoms very broadly, because things that they're worried about are things that should not be worried about at all. So they're very worried about policing people's sex lives and stuff like that, or saying this is a gender identity and all this kind of, and you can't have that, so these are rooted in the symptoms that they're looking at, are rooted in all kinds of bigotry. And so and I've said a bazillion times, churches should not be in the sex business, so we should not be condemning and policing other people's lives in that way. That has nothing to do with anything, so.
Yeah, for sure. And I feel like they would probably say something, because I was kind of thinking when you were talking, it's like maybe I need to try to channel, like not at all that I agree, channel some Deneen, channel some Vermeulen, and be like, what are they? And actually, I'm even channeling like a friend of mine who certainly doesn't have like really bigoted views, but is kind of someone who lost his Catholicism, but still has like an admiration for Catholicism and ended up becoming like really into philosophy. He's doing his PhD in philosophy now and is kind of worried about grounding meaning in something objective, and is like worried about the loss of that sort of. And we have these arguments because he's so worried about these things, and I'm kind of like, well, these things don't matter. But the kinds of things that he says is like, when you start to have a society where you just sort of like allow, there's not really any moral guidance, right? There's like, it's like, okay, like everything is allowed, then his worry is just like, well, then how do I know, or well, part of it, I don't know. I want to try to do justice to his view, because it's more complex than just like, oh, I like everyone needs to do the same thing for there to be meaning. But it's a version of that. But then the other part of it, I think, is more like, well, and maybe this even goes all the way back to the Greeks or something. That there's like kind of, how do you develop moral virtue or moral value? And it's like through effort and through strenuousness. And like, I think that's sort of where the strictness, like where some of the more intellectual, like sort of right-wing motivated is like, well, you need some kind of societal strictness, right, in order for people to be able to develop moral strength and moral virtue. And it's like, and we look at society and we think about, okay, like now in this liberal environment where everyone's allowed to do whatever they want, kind of, right? And then they're just glued to their screens and Instagram, all these messages of beauty, and then they're like, oh, maybe I can be other genders. Obviously, I'm channeling them right now just for the listener, right? Yeah. Like, I think like that their concern would just be like, well, there's no guidance, right? It's like, how do I develop moral virtue? How do I develop any of these things when just like everyone's allowed? Like maybe, and they might even say to you, John, I think you, like, I agree with you, like, working on these social housing, like that's a very like, consistent with Christianity. But on the other hand, it's like, that's just going to be a drop in the bucket of the decay, the moral decay of that's actually happening. That's why we actually need to seize politics, right? That's why, because the real action,
the decline of civilization.
Yeah. So I don't know. Like, what do you think about that?
Well, your Iran example is a good counterexample to the why we need to seize control. So you know what I mean? So yeah, they were all saying that, and guess what? the mullahs took over, and so suddenly you have a theocracy. It's been going on for 50 years or whatever, and look at what's happened, right? So if anything, it's beat the religion out of the people. They now don't want it. They don't want this at all anymore. I think in large numbers, more so than a lot of other places in the Middle East, where they had instead secular dictatorships that were oppressing people, and they only had the religion as their only offshoot to have any kind of personal say, and that's why they became more religious in the other places. I think in Iran, the opposite has happened, and they've done a terrible job. So I don't mean it. So it's not going to. You might think that you can have some kind of a theocracy that is some kind of command. I don't know what it is, a command economy, a command society. It isn't going to, the chances of that being very effective, I think, is nil from any kind of example we've seen. I don't see that as theoretically possible. And so all I can say is, yeah, is the little part that we're doing just a drop in the bucket, and it's against the entire torrent and tide. Maybe so. That, what am I supposed to do? You know what I mean? In other words, this is the part that I can do, and this is the part, because I think that one of the points when you were bringing up, Victor, in terms of the you included like all or whatever, everybody, like we all have to do it. We definitely, that's not the case in our perspective. So we are very happy to have all of these partners who are both in all of the other faith traditions, and people who are fully secular and partners who are atheists, in order to accomplish these ends. And we're not saying that you can't be Muslim and have a right relationship or be doing something meaningful with your life. Of course you can. And so we are not. So my perspective is that the pluralism is actually perfectly adapted to working together, so that we can actually have an outcome that we want to all achieve.
Yeah, Victor, this conservative political, I mean, you did a really good job of channeling your buddy there. But like what I hear in that is these two words that you kept saying, the we, the society, and then the word allow. Like, we can't allow everyone to do what they want, because they'll do the wrong thing. And that's the kernel of this disagreement, isn't it? Like, we can't let all these people run around and do whatever they want. But what's really being said there is I am not okay with being allowed to do whatever I want. I need the other, I need the authority, I need daddy to tell me what to do. So for all this rhetoric about liberalism being too tolerant, too feminine, too girly, it's the conservative bros talking about rootedness. Like, you're the pussies. If you're so rugged and committed to this idea of self-flourishing that you've made up, then go commit. You can read all the Greek virtues all day and work out all night, and you would if you had the balls, because no one's standing in your way. But they can't stand doing it on their own, because if someone else is on TikTok too much or changing the gender, what the hell does that have to do with your deep pursuit of meaning? No, it's because they need the other telling everyone else also to do it too, from the top down, for it to matter. So yeah, man up, beta, do it yourself, bitch.
I mean, I think there's that, but I think there's also there's that, but then I feel like there's also this like nostalgia for this time when, oh, like all your neighbors were going to church, right? And like, or at least when there was an expectation, right? And I think, I don't know, did we talk about this when we were covering Deneen last week? But I was kind of trying to say, like, what does he want, right? Because we were talking about how he wants this like kind of localism, maybe, like, because Deneen's like less crazy than Vermeulen, but still like kind of crazy. But he's more of like, oh, we need local communities, and it's like, he doesn't want like coercive authority, but he wants there to be room for cultures that make people feel ashamed for things that don't fit in or something, right? So it's not like but it's like the loss. It's like, because those community values where everyone felt the social pressure, kind of like the social imperative, well, they have to go to church. And if you're not going to church, like, that's weird, right? Like, that surely existed sometime maybe in the 1950s or 40s or who knows. But then it's like, and then now that that's lost, it's like, well, there's no incentive. So it's not exactly like, some of them like are not as crazy. Vermeulen would be like, well, I don't want the state to necessarily force people, but it's more that I want to somehow precipitate a cultural return where there is the pressure now, because there's no social pressure anymore. There should be more social pressure for people to like, engage in these kinds of forms of association, religious association.
Be the Nietzschean man. Put the burden on yourself. You don't need your dad to tell you what to do all the time.
the nostalgia misreads why that culture was operating that way. So this congregation was at its absolute height in the 1950s. We had a church that seated hundreds, and we had hundreds of active members, and they would come on a Sunday. And one of the reasons why they came on Sunday, maybe 3 times, I think we had 3 meetings a Sunday, because it was illegal to do anything else on Sunday. there was no TV to watch. Essentially, there was nothing else to do, and so churches, were able. We had actually even earlier, in the 19 teens and 20s, we would rent out the biggest theaters in the city on the Sunday evenings, and people would come. We'd fill 7,000 people would come to it because it was illegal to do anything else. This congregation,
You just bore them into it.
no, that everybody was bored. That's the point. And so what I'm saying, it's like a country where you have let's say you had this protection tariff wall that has been propping up an incredibly inefficient steel industry, and then suddenly you go to free markets and you break that down, and steel is now able to be imported in your country for 20 cents on the dollar that it takes you to produce it, so then your entire steel industry is gone and wiped out because it can't compete. What my answer to all of these guys is, if you want people to come to your church, make it worthwhile to go to it. Make people want to go. So what my church, now we're growing like crazy because people want to come to our online services because we have made them worth going to. So my answer to always to people is, if you don't come to church out of an obligation or something like that because you feel guilty or something like that, you should be coming because you want to. And if the church isn't doing such a thing that you would actually want to go, why are you going to it? And so, but all of these guys, they want to make you go because they don't want to make their church, they want to make it horrible still. They don't want to make it interesting.
No, I agree. I mean, that makes a lot of sense.
It appears from your YouTube that the way that you're making church valuable in people's lives is through education, and also through public free education. And you cover everything. We got Gnosticism on here. We got the Crusades. We got What Are Angels? And I was just wondering, in terms of your community and the congregation, do you feel like that intellectual bent is something that's really like a draw? Because, I mean, if you want to study these things, you kind of have to either read a lot by yourself or go to university and pay $3,000 per course for it. And is that something that you've noticed people are, I guess, hungry for? Is that the right way to put it?
Well, yeah. So there's sometimes people go to university and then they're able, unfortunately, the university is churning out way more people with graduate degrees than there is a need for actual professors anymore, right? And in a way, a problem.
John, that's
some
rude.
I don't want to be mean about it. I'm sorry.
No, it's true.
Just
it's true.
We are very aware of that.
Yeah.
And it's not because I'm actually upset with all of the universities that are saying, oh, well, now we're not going to even have what a liberal university education even was. We're going to eliminate history departments and classics departments. We're no longer going to teach all these things because we're going to somehow make this about jobs or something. But it has not been what the point of this was. So I think that the fact that we have we're in a place now in all of world history where we have higher percentage of the population than ever in all of human history that have been exposed to critical thinking, that are able to engage on these ideas that would have just been for the very top leisure class or the scholarly class in all of history before. That doesn't mean where again, you want to have an association with that. So you're going to sit, I could sit around in my room and just, read my Plato Bible, all day long, I've got the book, but I want to be able to engage with a community with these ideas. And so part of the whole point of having the church is that you have a community of people who want to engage with ideas, and you can share ideas. And like I say, we're not creedal, so we can do that in a pretty free form way. And so we don't only focus on our own little quirky history that comes through Protestantism and Mormonism and all that kind of thing, but we go all the way back into our whole Western civ roots, and we think about again, what was Plato saying, and what and what are we drawing from all of these other sources? What does that mean to our lives now? Or what meaning can we find in with that? So just having a place to engage with people. And so, yeah, in our particular church, we have one of our 5 pillars of mission is essentially continually learn and grow. So constantly going back and some people go to college and then they never read a book again. Our goal is to continue to have that experience even once you're out of college.
Love that.
It's a lot of work. You could just get Polyev to place somebody on the Supreme Court of Canada and make changes that way.
Comment. Well, the thing that I noticed about the article was funny to me was just that I felt like the whole structure of it was like sounded like a tanky, like except a right-wing tanky, because the whole article is just him complaining. If you don't know what that is, John, that's like a tanky is like a really hardcore Marxist who like supports like tanks coming into it's from when the tanks entered Prague, I think, back during the Soviet Union.
Okay.
In the sense that, he's it's just like he's basically just calling out all the other like fake conservatives, right?
Yeah.
It kind of sounds like a Marxist calling out all the other fake leftists, right? Who are like not really left. And then it's like my real version, is going to be hardcore, right? We're going to.
He was really weirdly backing into it, right? He's like, you guys you're not real. You're not real. That's not real conservatives. Yeah. The only thing who could possibly be a real conservative. And then he lists out his Catholic fascist.
Yeah, his integralist craziness. And I don't know if either of you guys picked up on this too, like just also calling back to the Deneen episode. Yeah, I felt like he was calling out Deneen specifically for not being serious enough, right? Because he talks about like localism, all you like localist conservatives, with no teeth. So I don't know. That's just
he doesn't like localist free marketers, cheerleaders of martyrdom.
It's also so divorced. I mean, it's obviously divorced from the Gospels, like goes without saying, but it's a very materialist argument that he's making. It's nothing to do with creedal, nothing to do with like the actual church and the church's purpose. It's just, this is functionally useful and we can get this done. Obviously, they won't ever get it done, but it's very much a Christianity without Christ type of what did we call it last time? Communitarianism?
Yeah, kind of like a hardcore communitarianism without any,
Yeah, but I mean, I think that again, it's like this structure. And this is the whole reason why they're attracted to wanting it to be Catholic. Is the idea is creating an org chart where they think that you can somehow stick God at the top and create an authoritarian structure. God, Pope, and it's all going to come top down that way. But the problem is that God doesn't speak to humans in a way that you can. With human words. So it's not like so that's not going to work out org chart wide. So you end up having at the top, a dictatorship, of a human. So
you don't even need God at the top. I don't think he's very interested in God. It's more
God's
like
giving it the legitimacy. That's why the church has to
right.
Exactly.
He lays it out pretty clearly here too. He says they want to order the nation according to natural and divine law. So that's a little bit of a red flag right there. Natural law is the way they used to talk about, natural right, natural law. So that's how they sort of that's how they derive what humans are like, natural law. And then divine law, I guess would mean more like what they derive from scripture. And those two, the state has to be in accordance with those things, right? So natural law, I don't know, that could be an anti-gay thing for those kinds of Catholics, and divine law would be whatever they say, whatever their interpretation of the Bible is. That's how the state has to. So it seems like he wants to unify the church and the state under a authoritarian kind of, and have a priesthood of the law.
Seems like it.
Anyway, it was great to talk to a non-psychotic Christian.
Well, and I've said it before, and that you can study the history of religion, and you can see it going both ways in the sense that religion has been used to justify authoritarian rule, and religion has been used as a source of criticism for authoritarian and unfair kinds of rule as well. And a lot of it depends on how you use it And that's where my pathological comment comes from. That some people just seem crazy and they just want to use religion and whatever tools are at their disposal to self-aggrandize and get what they want and convince people to follow them down on their crazy road to psychotic, whatever their goals are. That's why I think it interacts with people's psychology in a strange way. But when you're a nice, well-adjusted person, then sky's the limit on the good you can do.
Yeah. For
With
sure.
all, human ideas and institutions and so on, you can generally use all things for good or ill. And
Mhm.
certainly if you grew up in North Korea, you would be excused for believing that government is all bad and always bad. But you might be able to be if you're in a different society, different perspective, you might find, well, some governments could potentially do some good things, over and above that. And same thing, you could be growing up in a really terrible fundamentalist Christianity that denied your identity, that caused just very serious harm, and you'd be very justified in feeling that all religion is bad, and that's fine. And you don't have to not think that, in my view. That's fine. You know what I mean? You don't, because you live your life and without worrying about it. And I'm sorry that you were damaged in that way from that experience, and hopefully you will also transcend it. I'm not talking about any of you. I'm talking about this theoretical person.
Uh-huh.
And so, but all I can say is that hopefully then some of us who are engaged in this can also provide an alternative that is not doing that, and that in fact for people who don't have the luxury to get to study philosophy and come to all of these conclusions and things themselves. They just want to raise kids and maybe take them to a church, and because they have the sense that may be a good thing, to have an alternative where people aren't being kind of force-fed reactionary, destructive and harmful nonsense, but instead are working towards doing at least what they think locally is good, for their community. That's hopefully what we're trying to do.
Well said. Yeah.
All right. The channel
very good.
is Center Place, but it's spelt the correct way, which is RE at the end. So the Canadians.
That's
Center Place. You can go there to find a bunch of, I don't even know how to categorize. It's centuries of stuff, and it's not all to do with Christianity either. So I recommend you check that out. And guys, are we converted? Do you wanna head down there on a Sunday? We can go there on a Sunday morning.
Lecture or church or what's the word? Sermon?
No, these are pretty academic lectures.
Church is on Sunday. The lectures are on Tuesday.
Okay. Well,
Okay, there you go.
Maybe we'll
Awesome.
We'll start with the Tuesday.
But the lectures. So the lectures we haven't done in person since the pandemic. But
Okay.
and you guys, if any of you ever wanted to come, and we will tell me ahead of time, and it'd be fun.
Great.
Cool.
Sounds good.
All right, John. Thank you.
Yeah, it does sound
Thank
good.
you so much for the breath of sanity. Honestly,
For a refreshing perspective.
Yeah.
Thank all of you. And if you do want to go down any rabbit holes anytime in the future about the Trinity or predestination or all those things, I'm always happy to talk about any of those topics as well.
Great. I hope to get back to it soon.
Well, if we do a podcast on predestination, we've actually already done the podcast on predestination. We just haven't experienced it. So if that happens, it's happened. But I'd also like to talk to you about Gnosticism.
Gnosticism, sure, absolutely.
We read Run Catholic, who thinks that all of Nazism, liberalism, humanism, and communism are all Gnosticism.
Doesn't make any sense.
The darndest things.
All right, guys. Thanks very much. Thanks, everyone, for listening, and we'll catch you next week.
All right, bye-bye.